The desert of death. The twin suns blazed high in the sky, turning the endless desert into a sea of shimmering heat. The wind carried fine grains of sand, whispering like ghosts across the dunes. Beneath the cruel sun, a figure lay motionless. An alien woman, her body half buried in the sand. Her skin, a deep shade of violet, was cracked and dry. Her breathing was shallow, weak. Above her, dark shapes circled. Vultures. Their sharp eyes watched, waiting for her last breath. They had seen death before, and they knew it would not be long now. Far in the distance, another figure moved, a human, a stranger in the sands. Captain James Riker adjusted his goggles and scanned the horizon. The desert was unforgiving, a place where life did not belong. He had seen many things in his years as a soldier, but an alien left to die in the middle of nowhere. That was new. His boots crunched against the hot sand as he approached the body. He could see now. She was still alive, but barely. Her lips were cracked. Her hands twitched weakly. She was holding on to life by a thread. James sighed. Helping her would be a mistake. Aliens and humans didn't mix. Everyone knew that. The war had ended years ago, but the scars were still fresh. People didn't forget easily. And yet, he looked up. The vultures had noticed him now. Their wings flapped, restless. They did not like their meal being interrupted. James cursed under his breath. Damn it. Kneeling down, he placed a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was hot, burning with fever. She needed water, food, shelter, all things that were in short supply out here. Her eyelids fluttered. A whisper escaped her lips, a word in a language he didn't understand. James frowned. You're alive. She didn't respond. Her breathing was too weak. James glanced at the horizon. A storm was brewing. The wind was picking up, the air growing thick. If he left her here, she would die before the vultures even had their chance. He exhaled sharply. I must be losing my mind. A predator lurks. Lifting her wasn't easy. She was lighter than he expected, but the heat had drained his strength. He slung her over his shoulder and started moving. Each step felt heavier than the last. The sun pressed down on him, sweat dripping down his back. He needed to find shelter fast. Then he heard it. A low, guttural growl. James stopped. His grip on his rifle tightened. He turned his head slowly, scanning the dunes. Nothing. Just sand. Then movement. A shadow flickered behind a ridge. Yellow eyes glowed in the distance. James's heart pounded. A sand reaper. The creature was a nightmare made real. 8 feet tall, covered in bone-white armor, with claws sharp enough to rip through steel. It had been tracking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. James knew how this worked. The reaper wasn't just hungry. It was testing him, seeing if he was weak. The alien woman moaned softly in his arms. She was too weak to fight. It was up to him. James took a slow step backward. Think, Riker. Think. The reaper tilted its head, studying him. Then it took a step forward, then another. The sand barely shifted under its feet. It moved like a ghost. James knew he had only one chance. Run or fight. The storm was coming fast. The sky was darkening. If he could just get to the caves, he might have a chance. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his grip on the alien and ran. The race against death. The wind howled around him, throwing sand into his face. His legs burned as he sprinted toward the caves, his boots sinking into the dunes with every step. Behind him, the growling grew louder. Then, a screech. The reaper was coming. James pushed himself harder. The caves were close now, just over the next ridge. Then, pain. Something sharp tore through his shoulder. He stumbled but didn't fall. The reaper had swiped at him, barely missing his neck. Blood trickled down his arm. He didn't stop, couldn't stop. With a final burst of strength, he reached the caves and dived inside. The alien woman slipped from his arms as he spun around, rifle raised. The Reaper stopped just outside, watching. The storm had arrived, sand swirling around them, thick and blinding. The creature growled low, but it did not enter. It hated the dark. James exhaled, his chest rising and falling heavily. He looked down at the alien woman. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly. Then she spoke. "They're coming for me." James froze. His pulse pounded in his ears. Who? Who was coming? Before he could ask, the storm roared outside, drowning everything in darkness. The chase begins. The wind outside howled like a living beast, thick with swirling sand that clawed at the cave entrance. Inside, James Riker pressed his back against the cold stone, breathing heavily. His arm ached where the Reaper's claws had grazed him. Blood trickled down his sleeve, but he ignored it. The alien woman, Zira, if she even had a name, lay motionless on the cave floor, her violet skin bathed in the dim light of his wrist lamp. She had spoken just before passing out. "They're coming for me." James frowned. Who? His thoughts were interrupted by a distant growl. The Sand Reaper was still outside, pacing along the dunes. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. A sudden awakening. Zira stirred, her breathing uneven. Then, without warning, her body tensed. Her eyes flew open, glowing with an eerie silver light. James took a step back, reaching for his sidearm. Zira inhaled sharply then, a piercing shriek. James winced, his ears ringing. The sound was unnatural, vibrating through the cave walls. The Reaper outside let out a guttural roar in response. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Zira collapsed back onto the stone, unconscious again. James stared at her. What the hell just happened? Then, movement. He turned sharply toward the cave entrance. The Reaper was no longer alone. More shapes were gathering outside, just beyond the storm's veil. Tall, humanoid, not human. James's grip tightened around his rifle. Her people. And they had found her. The hunt begins. The figures outside did not speak. They did not call out. They moved like shadows, silent and precise. James cursed under his breath. He had no idea why this alien was so important, but he knew one thing. They weren't here for a rescue mission. One of the figures raised a device. A pulsing red light filled the cave. Zira's body twitched in response, like a puppet on invisible strings. James acted on instinct. He stepped between her and the invaders, raising his rifle. Not gonna happen. The nearest figure tilted its head. It moved with unnatural smoothness, stepping closer. James fired. The shot slammed into the figure's chest, but instead of falling, it shimmered. The bullet passed through as if it had hit nothing but air. James barely had time to react before the figure reached out. A blinding flash. Pain exploded in his head. His vision blurred. His body collapsed. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Zira's glowing eyes, fading, flickering, before everything went black. The truth unveiled. Darkness. James Riker's mind clawed its way back to the surface, like a drowning man gasping for air. His head throbbed with a sharp, stabbing pain. The last thing he remembered was the cave, the alien woman, Zira, and those things. His eyes snapped open. But this wasn't the cave. A new prison. Cold metal pressed against his back. The air smelled sterile, like burnt ozone mixed with something faintly metallic. Harsh, blue lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on smooth gray walls. James tried to sit up, but something yanked him back. Restraints. Thick metal cuffs bound his wrists and ankles to the table beneath him. Where the hell was he? His heart pounded as he scanned the room. It was small, windowless, and humming with an unnatural energy. No doors, no obvious exits, only sleek panels that pulsed with faint light. And then a voice. Cold. Mechanical. Not human. You should not have interfered, human. The interrogation. James's eyes darted to the corner of the room. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but its skin gleamed like polished metal. Its eyes glowed a dim, unsettling blue. It wasn't wearing armor. It was armor. An alien drone. Where is she? James growled, struggling against the restraints. His voice echoed off the metal walls. The drone tilted its head, studying him like a curious insect. The female is of no concern to you. She has been reclaimed. Reclaimed. James's mind raced. They left her to die in the desert. Now they want her back. Why? James spat. What do you want from her? The drone didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, placing a cold, three-fingered hand against his temple. James felt a sharp jolt of pain, like ice shooting through his skull. His vision blurred, memories flashing before his eyes. The desert, the Reaper, Zyra's glowing eyes. Then, a whisper. She carries something dangerous. Before James could process what that meant, the drone withdrew its hand. The pain faded, but the cold lingered. You're making a mistake, James hissed. She's not your enemy. The drone's eyes flickered. Neither are you. Yet. A desperate escape. The lights in the room dimmed, and for a moment, James thought the drone was leaving. But then, the restraints around his wrists tightened, digging into his skin. Your mind holds information we require. You will comply. James's pulse quickened. They were going to dig deeper. Into his memories, his thoughts, maybe even his very soul. But James Riker didn't survive years of war by giving up easily. As the drone turned away, its attention focused on a glowing panel. James twisted his wrist. He had felt something earlier, a loose pin in his sleeve. The Reaper's swipe must have torn it from his uniform. With slow, careful movements, he worked the pin into the lock of his restraint. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. The drone began humming, a low, mechanical sound that vibrated through the air. The lights on the walls pulsed faster. James could feel a sharp pain building behind his eyes. They were starting. With a final twist, the pin clicked. The restraint snapped open. James didn't wait. He lunged forward, ripping his other wrist free, then his ankles. The drone spun around, but it was too late. James grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal tool, and slammed it into the drone's head. Sparks flew. The machine staggered back, its glowing eyes flickering violently. Before it could recover, James was out the door. The ship of secrets. He sprinted down a dimly lit corridor, his boots pounding against the metal floor. The walls vibrated with the ship's strange energy, and the air felt thick, almost alive. Around every corner, he expected more drones, more enemies, but the halls were empty, eerily silent. Where was everyone? Then he saw it. A large glass chamber in the center of the ship. And inside, Zyra. She floated in a tank of glowing liquid, her eyes closed, her body limp. Strange cables were connected to her temples, feeding pulses of light into her veins. James's stomach twisted. They were draining her. But for what? Before he could move, a loud alarm blared through the ship. Red lights flashed, and a cold, familiar voice echoed through the halls. Intruder detected. Human presence unauthorized. James clenched his jaw. Time was running out. He had to get to Zyra. But first, he needed to know the truth. And he was about to find out just how dangerous saving her would be. Betrayal and escape. The ship's sirens wailed, their shrill cries echoing through the metallic corridors like the screams of the damned. Red lights pulsed overhead, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Captain James Riker sprinted down the narrow hallway, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. Behind him, the mechanical footsteps of alien drones grew louder, more urgent. They were hunting him now, and they wouldn't stop until he was either captured or dead. But James wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about Zira. She was somewhere on this ship, hooked up to machines that were draining her life. He didn't know why they wanted her, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to keep her. A glimpse of freedom. James rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. There, at the end of the corridor, was a thick, reinforced door. Through a small window in the center, he could see the chamber where Zira was held. She floated in a tank of glowing liquid, her body limp and pale. Wires snaked from her temples, feeding pulses of light into her veins. Her violet skin had turned almost translucent, and her eyes were closed, fluttering as if caught in some kind of nightmare. James's stomach twisted. They were killing her. He scanned the door for a control panel. There had to be a way to open it. His fingers danced over the buttons, desperate but precise. He'd done this 100 times before, in 100 different battles. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about saving her. With a hiss, the door slid open. James rushed inside, ignoring the alarms blaring overhead. He reached the tank and slammed his fist against the emergency release button. The glowing liquid drained quickly, and Zira's body slumped forward, limp and lifeless. "Come on," James muttered, pulling her out of the tank. "Don't you die on me now." Her skin was ice cold, and her breathing was shallow. But there was still a pulse. Faint, but there. He slung her over his shoulder and turned toward the exit. That's when he heard it. A voice, familiar, but twisted. "Going somewhere, Captain." Betrayal in the ranks. James froze. Standing in the doorway, blocking his only escape, was Sergeant Cole, his old friend, his brother in arms. But something was wrong. Cole's eyes glowed faintly blue, the same eerie light he'd seen in the drones. James's heart sank. "Cole," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the alarms. Cole smiled, but it wasn't the smile James remembered. It was cold. Empty. "You should have stayed out of this, James," Cole said, stepping into the room. "You don't know what you're dealing with." James tightened his grip on Zira, his mind racing. How long had Cole been working with them? Was he even human anymore? "I know enough," James spat. "They left her to die in that desert, and you were going to let them." Cole's smile faded. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "She's dangerous," Cole said quietly. "You don't understand what she is." James shook his head. "I don't care. I'm not leaving her behind." Cole sighed, almost sadly. "Then you leave me no choice." He raised his weapon. James didn't wait. He fired first. The escape. The room exploded into chaos. James's shot hit Cole square in the chest, but instead of falling, Cole staggered back, his body flickering like a glitch in a broken video feed. He wasn't fully human anymore. The aliens had done something to him, changed him. But James didn't stop. He fired again, and again, driving Cole back toward the wall. Then he turned and ran. The corridors blurred around him as he sprinted through the ship, Zira's limp body heavy on his shoulder. The alien drones were everywhere now, their cold, mechanical voices echoing through the halls. Intruder detected, human presence unauthorized. James didn't care. He had one goal: get off this ship. He spotted an emergency escape pod up ahead and bolted toward it. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't slow down. As he reached the pod, a sharp pain tore through his side. He glanced down and saw blood. One of the drones had hit him. But it didn't matter. With a final burst of strength, he threw Zira into the pod and slammed the door shut behind them. The pod shuddered, then launched into space, the force pressing James back against the seat. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Zira stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing brighter than before. But something was wrong. Her body pulsed with an uncontrollable energy, and her voice, when she spoke, was filled with fear and something else. Something darker. "I'm not just a survivor," she whispered. "I'm a weapon." The power within. The stars streaked past the small escape pod, painting lines of light across the endless black canvas of space. Inside, the hum of failing life support systems was the only sound, except for Captain James Riker's ragged breathing. His side burned from the wound, a deep, searing cut from the alien drone's weapons. But it wasn't the pain that made his hands tremble. It was her. Zira. She sat across from him, her eyes no longer just glowing. They were blazing. Silver light pulsed beneath her violet skin, running through her veins like liquid fire. Her body trembled, not from weakness, but from something far more dangerous. Power. Unstable, uncontrollable power. And James had no idea how much longer she could hold it in. The breaking point. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The tension in the tiny pod felt like it could crack the metal walls. James finally broke the silence. His voice was low, cautious. "What did you mean back there?" Zira didn't look at him, her hands clenched into fists, her glowing veins pulsing faster. "I'm not supposed to be alive," she whispered. "They left me in that desert because they thought I'd die before this. Before it happened." James narrowed his eyes. Before what happened? She looked up at him then, and for the first time, James saw something that made his blood run cold. Fear. "I'm not just an alien," she said quietly. "I'm a weapon, a living weapon. They built me to destroy." James's mind reeled. A weapon? The woman he risked everything to save wasn't just some abandoned alien. She was something far more dangerous. But if she was meant to destroy, why did she seem so afraid of herself? Before he could ask, the pod shuddered violently. The navigation panel blinked red. They were entering Earth's atmosphere, but something was wrong. The pod was overheating. The power Zira was radiating was interfering with the pod systems. If they didn't land soon, they'd both burn up before they even hit the ground. Crash landing. James grabbed the manual controls, wrestling with the failing systems. "You need to control it," he shouted over the blaring alarms. "I can't." Zira's voice was strained, her body convulsing as waves of energy rippled off her skin. The metal walls around her began to warp and bend, unable to withstand the force. The pod spun out of control, fire licking at the windows as they plummeted toward the earth below. James gritted his teeth, pulling with everything he had to steady the descent. They weren't going to die like this. Not after everything. With a final, desperate effort, James managed to guide the pod toward a dense forest, away from any populated areas. The trees rushed up to meet them, and with a deafening crash, the pod tore through the canopy, slamming into the ground with bone-rattling force. For a moment, everything was silent. Then James coughed, tasting blood in his mouth. The pod was a twisted wreck around them, but he was alive. Somehow, he turned to Zira. She was slumped against the wall, motionless. The glow beneath her skin had dimmed, but it was still there, flickering like the dying embers of a fire. James reached out, his voice hoarse. "Zira." Her eyes snapped open. But they weren't just glowing anymore. They were burning. The power unleashed. Zira screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was something primal, something otherworldly. A wave of energy blasted out from her body, shredding what was left of the pod, and sending James flying backward into the dirt. Trees bent and snapped under the force, the ground itself trembling as if the earth feared her power. James struggled to his feet, his heart pounding. He'd faced death before. He'd stared into the eyes of enemies, monsters, and things no human should ever see. But this was different. Zira stood in the wreckage, her body levitating inches above the ground. Her skin pulsed with light, cracks of pure energy spiderwebbing across her arms and face. Her eyes glowed like twin suns, and when she spoke, her voice echoed with something ancient and terrible. "They're coming," she whispered. "And if they find me, they'll use me to destroy this planet." James's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, a sharp mechanical voice crackled through the communicator on his wrist. "Captain Riker, this is Earth Command. You are harboring a hostile alien weapon. Stand down and surrender immediately, or we will be forced to neutralize both of you." James stared at the communicator, then at Zira. Neutralize? They weren't coming to help. They were coming to kill her. But looking into Zira's terrified, glowing eyes, James knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the real threat. The real threat was still out there, and it was coming for them both. The final stand. The forest was burning. Flames lit the night sky, casting flickering shadows across the shattered wreckage of the escape pod. The thick scent of smoke mixed with the metallic tang of scorched earth. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of approaching aircraft vibrated through the ground. Captain James Riker crouched behind a fallen tree, his breath ragged, his side still bleeding from the wound he'd taken aboard the alien ship. But he wasn't thinking about the pain. He was thinking about Zira. She stood at the center of the clearing, her feet barely touching the ground, her body pulsing with a light that had grown brighter and more dangerous with every passing hour. Her violet skin now shimmered like molten glass, thin cracks of energy running across her arms, her neck, and down her spine. Her eyes were no longer just glowing. They were blazing like stars on the brink of collapse. James had seen many things in his life: wars, alien invasions, unspeakable horrors, but nothing prepared him for this. Zira wasn't just an alien anymore. She was something else. The enemy of my enemy. The sharp voice of Earth Command crackled through James's wrist communicator again, cutting through the chaos. "Captain Riker, this is your final warning. Surrender the alien immediately, or we will engage lethal force. You have 60 seconds to comply." James's jaw clenched. He glanced at Zira, who was staring at the sky, her face illuminated by the growing light of incoming gunships. Her breathing was heavy, labored, as if she was holding something inside, something that wanted to break free. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll kill us both." James swallowed hard. He knew she was right. The military wasn't here to negotiate. They saw Zira as a threat, nothing more. And maybe they were right. But he also knew this: whatever was coming for Zira was worse than anything Earth Command could throw at them. He moved closer to her, his voice low but firm. "Listen to me. You're stronger than this. You can control it." Zira shook her head, tears mixing with the light radiating from her skin. "I can't. They made me to be a weapon, James. I was never meant to survive." James placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the heat of her power buzzing beneath his fingers. "You're more than what they made you. I saw it in that desert. You fought to stay alive. That wasn't the weapon. They left you to die, and you refused." For a moment, Zira's light dimmed, and James saw the fear in her eyes give way to something else: hope. But that moment didn't last. The first strike. The sky exploded in a hail of gunfire. Gunships descended from the clouds, their searchlights slicing through the smoke and darkness. The ground shook as heavy boots stormed into the clearing. Soldiers, armed to the teeth, their weapons trained on Zira. James raised his hands, stepping in front of her. "Don't shoot. She's not your enemy." But Earth Command wasn't listening. They fired. The first shot hit James in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Pain exploded through his body, but he barely felt it. Because that was the moment Zira broke. Her scream echoed through the forest, a sound of pure agony and rage. The light from her body surged outward in a blinding wave, ripping through the trees, the ground, the very air itself. Soldiers were thrown back like rag dolls, their weapons melting in their hands. The gunships overhead shuddered, their engines failing as the wave of energy hit them. One by one, they fell from the sky, crashing into the forest with fiery explosions. James shielded his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. When the light finally dimmed, he looked up, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Zira hovered above the ground, her body glowing like a miniature sun. The forest around her was nothing but ash and rubble. The soldiers were gone. The gunships were burning wrecks. But Zira was still standing, and she wasn't done. The alien arrival. Before James could call out to her, the sky above them split open with a sound like tearing metal. A massive alien ship descended from the clouds, its dark hull covered in pulsating symbols that glowed the same eerie blue as the drones on the ship where James had first found Zira. The ground trembled beneath its weight, and a cold mechanical voice echoed from the ship's speakers. "Surrender the weapon, or this planet will be destroyed." James's blood ran cold. This was it. The real enemy had arrived. Zira turned to face the ship, her eyes blazing with defiance. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of fear and fury. "They'll take me, and they'll use me to destroy your world." James struggled to his feet, his vision blurry from pain and exhaustion, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "They're not taking you," he said. "Not while I'm still breathing." Zira's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the ground shook as the alien ship's weapons charged. This was their final stand. James knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But they weren't out of hope. Not yet. Humanity's choice. The sky burned. A crimson glow bathed the shattered forest as the alien ship hovered overhead, its weapons primed, humming with lethal energy. The ground beneath Captain James Riker's feet vibrated with the ship's power, and the air felt thick, heavy, like the entire planet was holding its breath. But James wasn't looking at the ship. He was looking at Zira. She floated a few feet above the ground, her body a beacon of unstable energy. The cracks of light in her skin pulsed faster, brighter, as if her very cells were tearing apart from within. Her eyes, once filled with fear and confusion, now burned with something far more dangerous. "Resolve. I can stop them," Zira whispered, her voice echoing with unnatural power. "But if I do, I won't come back from it." James's heart pounded. He staggered forward, every muscle in his body screaming from exhaustion, blood still seeping from his wounds. But his voice was steady. "There's another way," he said, his eyes locked onto hers. "You're not a weapon, Zira. You're more than what they made you." But the alien ship above them didn't care about words. The low, mechanical voice thundered across the clearing. "Final warning. Surrender the weapon, or Earth will be eradicated." James clenched his fists. This was it. The choice wasn't just Zira's anymore. It was humanity's. The speech that changed everything. The ship's weapons crackled with growing energy, ready to fire. But James stepped forward, raising his arms toward the sky, standing between Zira and the alien ship. His voice, hoarse but defiant, echoed through the ruined forest. "You want her," he shouted. "You'll have to kill me first." The ship paused. The weapons held their charge, but they didn't fire. James took another step forward, his voice rising with each word. The weight of Earth's survival pressed on his shoulders, but he didn't falter. "You call her a weapon," he said, pointing at Zira, "but she's not. She's proof. Proof that no matter how much you try to control or destroy, life fights back. She was left to die in your desert, abandoned by her own people, hunted by yours, and now you think you can take her and use her to destroy us." James shook his head, his eyes blazing with defiance. "But you made one mistake." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You underestimated humanity." The alien ship buzzed with static, as if processing his words. "You think we're weak because we care," James continued, his voice steady. "You think compassion is a flaw. But that's why you'll never win. We protect our own. And Zira, she's one of us now." The forest fell silent. Even the ship seemed to hesitate. Then, Zira's voice, soft, trembling, cut through the stillness. "I'm not their weapon," she whispered. "I'm your hope." The choice. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the alien ship's weapons dimmed. A new voice, different from the cold, mechanical one, echoed from the ship. This one was deeper, older, filled with something James couldn't quite place. Regret. Your compassion is unexpected. James held his breath. The ship hovered for a moment longer, its shadow stretching across the forest like a looming specter. Then, slowly, it began to rise. The weapons powered down, and the oppressive hum of energy faded. They were leaving. But as the ship ascended into the clouds, the voice returned one last time. "This isn't over, human. The galaxy is watching." And with that, the ship vanished into the night sky. The aftermath. The forest was quiet again, but it felt different, lighter, like the weight of impending doom had finally lifted. James turned to Zira, who now stood on the ground, her light dimming, her breathing slow and steady. The cracks of energy in her skin faded, leaving only faint scars as reminders of what she had almost become. She looked at James, her eyes softer now, filled with something he hadn't seen before. "Gratitude. You saved me," she whispered. James smiled, though it hurt. "No," he said, his voice warm despite the exhaustion. "You saved us." Zira reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The warmth of her touch felt human, real. For the first time since he found her in that desert, James believed they had a future, not just for Zira, but for all of them. Because in the end, it wasn't power or weapons that saved the world. It was compassion. And in that moment, under the stars of a now safe Earth, humanity didn't just survive. It triumphed. Final reflection. As Zira and James disappeared into the forest, the world would never know how close it had come to annihilation. But the galaxy was watching. And somewhere out there, beyond the stars, something far worse was waiting.